and this is again where there's a duality, right?
Yeah.
Because I do think the script is awfully messy. There are characters that do not have as much space here to develop or to have any sort of impact. People have
Mm-hmm.
talked about Evangeline Lilly here. And I don't know if it's a result of the controversy surrounding her lately. Maybe she was cut down in the film because of that. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
But here's where I'm okay with her character being restrained here a little bit, even if you disregard the controversy, and maybe the editing down of the character had nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
What it really had to do with mostly is that we finally get a Scott and Cassie movie.
Yeah.
This movie is about lost time from two different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
You get Kang's perspective with him being trapped in the quantum realm, being banished there by the King dynasty, if you will. And that is a big part of this movie. And then it's
Yeah.
also a movie about lost time as it relates to the relationship of Scott and Cassie. There's been a couple of reviews that have done a great job of breaking this down,
Mm-hmm.
that over the course of the MCU, and as long as we've known Scott as Ant-Man, he's lost about 10 years of that relationship by being in prison, by being trapped in the quantum realm,
Yeah.
and everything that had to do with Endgame and the blip, and him in house arrest and the second Ant-Man movie. He clearly loves his daughter. Going back to the first Ant-Man, she has been such a pivotal part of these movies, and so much of his motive is to be the hero that she thinks that he is. That's a line from the first movie. It's repeated
Yep.
here as well.
Yep.
That has been his number one motive throughout all of the MCU, as well as, fighting alongside the Avengers and saving the universe. That's kind of important as well. But so
Sure.
much of that relationship is about lost time, and his devotion to her despite that lost time. And what this movie is more than anything else, at least from Scott's perspective, it is about that relationship. It's about her being in jail early on and him questioning her choices, which then she, puts a mirror up to him. What are you doing these days? You're writing a book. I don't know if that's enough. And then they get to the
Yeah.
quantum realm, and that relationship becomes all the more fully realized when it's there. It's just her, or excuse me, it's just him and Cassie. They're on their own little journey where the rest of the Ant fam is trying to find them. And so it becomes this movie about them. Finally, after 3 years and a couple of Avengers movies, he
Yeah.
finally gets time to be with her and to explore that relationship. And then from a mirroring perspective with King and what it means for him in terms of lost time, I find that interesting that this movie is about a father doing whatever it takes to save his daughter as a result of this conqueror who feels trapped and
Yeah.
lost in
The
time as
parallels
well.
there are interesting.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Do you think it earned the pathos that it was going for by the end too? Because I feel like that's
Well,
another question we can
yeah.
have about that. Because I'm with you. I love what the film is going for with regard to those paternal parallels. Kang isn't really a paternal figure in that way, but
in terms of lost time, he's
yeah,
a man that has been lost to time as well.
yeah,
And ironically, is this being that can control time, but still became a victim of it himself.
right.
And in order to get back to back to Earth, or back to this, the universe where everything is taking place, he
Right.
has to cut through the barrier of this father who is trying desperately to clutch onto his daughter because of his own lost time within
Yeah.
that relationship.
Yeah, for sure. And I love those parallels. And it's honestly why, yeah, the Wasp or Hope taking a back seat as she does is perhaps necessary for that to happen, which is, again, why the movie shouldn't really be called Ant-Man and the Wasp
It should be
Quantumania.
called Ant-Man and Cassie. It should
Yeah.
be the name of the film.
Yeah, honestly, it should. And it's why we have this specific narrative that we sometimes see in a lot of sci-fi adventure films, at least within a franchise, where our main group of heroes will find themselves on separate adventures. And this is a comparison to something like The Empire Strikes Back, the classic Star Wars movie that did that exact same thing, and
Hmm.
perhaps the best example of it. That movie does it so well, but it's
Yeah.
proof that it's hard to do that. It's hard to get that right in a commercial film like this, and I know you need to tell it that way in order to really drive home that point you're making about Scott and Cassie's relationship.
Hmm.
I didn't really buy their chemistry though. I
Mm.
kind of struggled with it a little bit, and I don't know if it's the script going back and forth in a certain way. Maybe it's more of an editorial issue than anything else. I wasn't so sure on Catherine Newton's performance. I
There's been
was
a lot of talk about that as well.
yeah, I don't think it's bad, but there was something about their relationship that when it gets to its really crucial emotional beats, I felt like I was still reaching for something that didn't quite get there. And maybe it's more on me. I was constantly thinking of the fact that this is our first time seeing this actress portray Cassie, especially after Endgame. We actually had another actress play Cassie for a brief moment. And it was actually a really tender moment.
Yeah,
Uh,
I
and
agree.
what
Yeah.
was her Emma Furman? Her name was, and I think I heard that there is some unfortunate circumstances as to how she found out she wasn't recast as Cassie for this specific movie. I don't know all the details, but I heard that there was some dialogue around that. But I kept going back to that moment that they have together in Endgame and thought, this is
It's
beautiful.
good. Hmm.
And to see it again in this movie, or to at least try to capture those same emotional beats, but with a different actress that felt like she was giving a very different performance, I felt like I was doing all of that work over again. And
Hmm.
it honestly put me a little bit behind when trying to get to those payoffs that I think the film wanted to.
Yeah, I don't know what the behind the scenes mechanics was. Perhaps there was
Yeah.
some politics at play that we don't know about. It was announced in 2020 that Emma Furman was going to be replaced by
Yeah.
Catherine Newton, and
Okay.
she posted on Twitter that she only found out when the news became public. So she found out when
Yeah.
everyone else did, which is
Isn't that kind of a
unfortunate.
common trend, unfortunately? I feel like that happens a lot.
I'm
You
sure
found out
it's happened
I mean, it happens
countless
a lot
times in
with
Hollywood.
sports. We talk about this with sports all the time too.
Absolutely.
With the
Yeah.
NHL more specifically than anything.
Yeah, no, this happens all the time, I'm sure. But to your point, it is a little disappointing because that moment in Endgame is incredible. It's really
Yeah.
great. I believe
Yeah.
Ryan brought this up on this last week's show as well on
Yeah.
522. That moment specifically in Endgame, it is fantastic. It's some of
Yeah.
Paul Rudd's best acting in the MCU,
I agree.
and Emma Furman is great. Yeah, they have wonderful chemistry there. It's a brief moment, so who's to say if you were to expand that out to a full feature that the chemistry would be there,
Yeah.
given everything that
That's a good question.
Quantumania gets into. But that moment in a microcosm in Endgame is great. So it makes you wonder why they did recast. Now, I will say, I don't know if I'm as critical of Catherine Newton as everyone else is. I think what's
Okay.
interesting about her performance here is that she does bring a little spunk to the character.
Which I
Early
like.
on, we see her in jail and we see that she is motivated to have some sort of philosophical approach to what's happening around her,
Yeah.
because what we find out, she's in jail because she was standing up for the cops harassing homeless people. So
Right.
she was trying to do something noble and then used Ant-Man technology against the police, which landed her in jail.
There's a
And
funny
she-
gag involving a police car that I will
Yes,
acknowledge was
it's
pretty
very good.
Yeah.
And then she uses that to then point a finger at her father, who is simply taking advantage of his fame as an Avenger, right? Where he's doing public appearances and he has a podcast now and he's writing this book.
And he listens to his own book all the time in his car.
Exactly. And I do love the humor of that as well.
That's
And
where I
Paul
really
Rudd-
sense Peyton Reed more than anything else. Like those opening minutes, I think were the closest I was reminded of like the comedic timing of movies like Down with Love or Bring It On.
Mhm.
I sensed a little bit of that there. There was a snarkiness to it that I thought was, I thought was pretty
Yeah.
effective. I thought the opening minutes
I
were pretty
agree.
funny.
I thought the bookends of the film were written very well. It definitely had that
I'm not opposed to that. Yeah.
traditional, Ant-Man levity that we've seen, with this character. And Paul Rudd is very good in heightening the comedic levels of what's happening there as well.
Right.
I guess what's interesting with this film, and this was a little bit of a concern coming into the film, is how this sudden change in tone would work, because we've known these Ant-Man films to be really funny and comical and a little bit goofy. And it does
smaller,
maintain
literally
and small.
smaller in scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although
And
this one's actually more literally small, given the circumstance. It's a bigger movie,
like,
but it's
yeah, they're so tiny. They're in a completely different universe.
yeah,
Which ironically becomes bigger in scale and scope.
yeah, sure.
But tonally, with the introduction of King and what he's going to represent to the larger MCU, it did have a little bit more of a grounded gravitas to it, right? It was a little bit more serious in tone comparatively. I think they're able to thread that needle well for the most part. Tone was never really an issue for me here.
I'm with
as
you.
much as it was the writing of the film and, trying to balance everything that it's doing. But as it relates to Catherine Newton, though, circling back to her, I think she plays into that balancing act of tone very well. And again, that spunk with Cassie and how that reverberates itself towards Scott as the film progresses, and how that really never deviates. I mean, even when things are
commits to it.
more active in the final act of the film, she's still speaking to and trying to encourage Scott to be that hero that she thinks, or that he thinks that she, that he thinks that she thinks of him to be. I think I said that right.
I know what you're trying to get at, so we'll assume you said it right.
But at any rate, and that's ultimately why Scott makes the choices he does at the end of the film, right? Where he is thinking about her and makes a sacrifice based off of her encouragement of him to look outside of himself, look outside of their relationship, and think about the broader picture.